I welcome our speakers to an exceedingly timely talk. I'm sure we will have more people joining us as we get going in this discussion. Unfortunately, our topic got even more timely. I am very grateful to Dr. Dmitry Gorenburg and Dr. Barbara Walker and our very own Keith Hansen for joining us. We also have on our panel today Sherry Rosenblum. Many of you may have remembered seeing Sherry on previous panels when we had CNA Military Advisory Board speakers. So given all that we have to cover today, I'm going to go ahead and get started. You have bios for the people involved, but Dmitry, I'll ask you to just give the sort of one-sentence summary of who you are before you get started, and then jump into our topic. And I know everybody is watching news feeds, and we're very grateful that Dmitry is here with us and just turned down a request for an interview from one of the Russian media sources. So with that, Dmitry, please take it away.
Great, thanks very much. So my background is I'm a research scientist at CNA, and I've been here at CNA for over 20 years now, working on Russian military and Russian security issues. I'm also the editor of the journal Problems of Post-Communism, which is the descendant of what used to be the USIA journal Problems of Communism that those of you who worked on the Soviet Union back in the Cold War days may remember. So I'm based in the Boston area, and I'm also have an affiliation with Harvard's Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. So that's my background. I'll eventually get into the current situation, but I want to give a little bit of background before we get to that, and just talk about how we got here. Ukraine-Russia relations. There's a long prehistory there that I think Barbara is going to get to, but I want to focus on developments since Ukrainian independence in 1991. And the one sort of key thing that we should remember is that Ukraine played a key role in the breakup of the Soviet Union. There was a referendum in December 1991 on Ukrainian independence, and you can see here by a breakdown by regions of support for Ukrainian independence in that referendum. And as you can see, it was pretty widespread. The one area where it wasn't an overwhelming majority was in Crimea, where even there it was over 50%. So that's important to keep in mind as we keep going. But the key point is that referendum directly led to that was very early December 1991, and then by the end of December, Yeltsin and the leaders of Ukraine and Belarus had agreed to break up the Soviet Union. So this was the proximate cause, in a way, of the breakup of the Soviet Union. Now, one thing that I think is important when we talk about Ukraine is that it is linguistically divided. And so here you see a map of one way in which it's divided, and you can see the red areas are the areas that are predominantly Ukrainian speaking. And this is I should be clear, this is pre-2014. Some situations have changed a bit with more. There's a little bit more emphasis on even people in the southeast trying to speak Ukrainian in some contexts now, although Russian still dominates. So, but ethnic, does not mean ethnic divisions. This is linguistic divisions. There are lots of Russian-speaking Ukrainians, as you can see, in the east and the south. So, and the only place that had a Russian majority was in Crimea, and then there's a significant ethnic Russian populations in the east, but still the majority was Ukrainian. So that's one way of thinking about divisions in Ukraine. Another way is political divisions, and so I'm going to show you another map or a series of maps, and these are a set of election results from 1994, 2004, and 2010. And you can see the linguistic map reproduced to some extent to a greater or lesser extent in some of these maps. And so that highlights the extent to which political divisions reflected some of these linguistic divisions in Ukraine. Now, there were other sources of division as well that prevented, let's say, political consolidation in Ukraine over the 30 years of independence. One key factor is corruption, which was widespread in the political system and in the economic system, and really played a big role in preventing economic and political stability in the country throughout the post-Soviet period. When we get back to the question of the Russia-Ukraine relationship, one other important factor from the 90s that we have to keep in mind is the division of the Black Sea Fleet. So the Black Sea Fleet was historically based in Sevastopol. So that became Ukrainian territory in 1991. But there was a dispute over, unlike other military units in the newly independent states that just became, that came to belong to that country after independence, which is how, say, Turkmenistan had one of the largest air forces in the world in the early 1990s. In the Black Sea Fleet, for various reasons, ended up being contested between Russia and Ukraine. So it took some years, and in 1997, the negotiation was completed, and the fleet was divided between Russia and Ukraine, and Russia was given the right to continue to base its part of the fleet in Sevastopol for 20 years. And this was then extended, as you can see on this slide down at the bottom right, in 2010 during the Yanukovych presidency. So, but this created one of the sources of subsequent conflict for Russia and Ukraine, which is the basing of Russia's Black Sea Fleet and whether it could continue to be based in Crimea or would have to leave. And this was a source of tension throughout, especially the Yushchenko presidency in the late 2000s. So just something to keep in mind as we keep going, that there was this issue. So that brings us to the 2004 Orange Revolution, which is kind of when I think a lot of people in the West first sort of got a sense that there was a potential for instability in Ukraine and a potential for conflict there. And so this was primarily a domestic issue between the sort of the Eastern political elite, if you remember those maps. Let's see if we can go back to that. So between the south, the Donetsk, the kind of the Donetsk area political elite from the eastern part of Ukraine, and the more kind of central Kiev elite represented by Yushchenko, and the Donetsk part was Yanukovych, and the Russian government very much took a side here and supported Yanukovych, the Eastern, the more pro-Russian, seen as the more pro-Russian candidate, and this kind of backfired because it was clear that he had lost the election, but there was various kind of fairly blatant falsification efforts, and there was popular demonstrations and protests and so forth, and that eventually led to a rerun of the election and the election of Yushchenko, who was probably the most anti-Russian president to that point. But this political divide persisted, as you can see in the 2010 map, where at that point the more pro-Russian candidate, Yanukovych, the one who had lost in 2004, actually won in 2010. So we have this kind of back and forth, fairly even split of the within the political system. And Yanukovych, although counted out in 2004, he managed to survive, became first prime minister, and then later, as I said, elected president. So that gets us to 2014. And I'll talk a little bit about, in a little more detail about that conflict, because that really kind of sets up a lot of the conditions for what we're seeing now. And the proximate cause there was that Ukraine had been straddling the line between Russia and the EU for years. And in 2013, for various reasons, it became impossible, primarily because there was a choice that the Ukrainian government had to make between an association agreement with the EU or joining the customs union with Russia. And it couldn't be in both because of the various rules of how customs unions are set up and so forth, which I honestly don't know in depth because I'm not an economist. So Yanukovych was the president at the time. As I said, he's pro-Russian, but he was trying to negotiate the best deal. And for a while, it looked like he would go with the EU, despite Russian pressure, which included, in August of 2013, a temporary trade boycott, in fact. So, but then some additional pressure, and possibly some carrots as well, were applied. And Putin, there was a well-known Putin phone call to Yanukovych, and this was followed by a sudden switch at the last minute, and Yanukovych announced he would go with customs union with Russia. And that led to protests, which were then relatively harshly suppressed and resulted in an accelerating confrontation, which then led to the overthrow of Yanukovych and his removal, and then the events that I'll get to in a second. So how did Yanukovych was at this point fairly unpopular, in part because he had set up some fairly confrontational policies. So he had, vis-a-vis the more pro-Western side in the Ukrainian political spectrum, he had introduced a law that made Russian a regional language, which upset the nationalists. He arrested his most significant political opponent, Yulia Tymoshenko, who had lost to him the presidential election in 2010. And there was a really sort of obvious effort to create what we might call a controlled democracy. So he was buying off legislators, he was changing the rules to restore a much stronger presidency. He was engaged in vote rigging. So these were all sort of factors that led his opponents to think that they were running out of time, and if he wasn't stopped, then there would be a kind of a permanent quasi-dictatorship by him and his allies. At the same time, there was a lot of corruption happening. So the economy was controlled by a few oligarchs from Donetsk. You can see Donetsk on this map here. There were very opaque gas deals happening with Russia that were people were lining their own pockets. And the top leaders, and particularly Yanukovych, had in very short order amassed very large personal wealth, estimates of $12 billion in personal wealth, Yanukovych and his family, by the time he was removed. And so this created very strong conditions for anti-Yanukovych sentiment in the country. On the Russian side, we also saw fears that Russia could completely lose Ukraine. So this had begun back in 2004, where with the Orange Revolution, this was when there was a first idea in the Russian elite, which has now become kind of part of their core belief system, that the West engineers these popular protests to set up to remove anti-Western leaders around the world. This is just not just around Russia, although it began for them with 2004, and then retrospectively Serbia and Milosevic as well. so then with 2014, they saw the same kind of model in action, which they'd also believed had happened in the Arab Spring, where these popular protests are engineered by the CIA or by some Western agencies to then give an excuse to overthrow an anti-Western politician with the threat of military force backing it up if it doesn't work out. And they pointed to Libya, for example, or as examples where this kind of model had been used. So from the Russian side, there was this fear that Ukraine would be lost, and they were trying to economically and to some extent politically reintegrate the former Soviet space, not as part of like a Soviet, a new Russian empire, but in economic terms at the very least. And this integration would be definitely incomplete without Ukraine. So they made a civilization argument that Ukraine and Russia were closely linked, kind of brother peoples and so forth. There were close economic links between Russia and Ukraine. There were single supply chains and a lot of manufacturing, particularly in the defense industry, also in agricultural products. So this was on the economic side. There was a need to include Ukraine. There was also, and we're seeing this expressed again today, fears of encirclement if Ukraine became to be part of the Western space, so that hostile forces would be around Russia. There were also on the domestic side fears that if Ukraine became a successful Western democracy, it would be an example to Russians, and the Russian leadership in the aftermath of protests that had happened in Russia in 2011, 2012 was concerned about that possibility as well. There were also lesser issues such as possible fears that one channel of personal enrichment through these corrupt gas deals would be cut off if Ukraine went the other direction, and so there's this image of Putin kind of always playing 10-dimensional chess or something, and but I firmly believe that in 2014, what was actually happening was that Russia acted not from strength, but from a sort of weakness, a fear of loss, is I guess the way I would put it. So the Russian leadership and to Putin specifically were reacting tactically to what he saw as a major potential defeat. So because as far as Russia was concerned, they had gone from Ukraine rejecting Europe, with Yanukovych accepting the customs union, to a victory by anti-Russian forces in just a few days. And so to me, the intervention in Crimea showed signs of panic in Moscow after this unexpected takeover of the Ukrainian government by protesters. And there were very good reasons for them to be panicked. They feared the loss of the Sevastopol naval base, and that a pro-Western government would kick them out. There were also geopolitical considerations. As I mentioned, there was this perception that this was part of a Western plot. And so Putin really felt that Ukraine was about to be lost, and taking Crimea would reduce that blow and also destabilize Ukraine, preventing it from going over to the West completely. To my mind, this was probably a miscalculation, because given Ukraine's track record, if it had been left alone, the new government would have probably fallen into infighting just as quickly as previous pro-Western governments. And Putin would have found new allies or the same old allies, and that sort of game of influence peddling within Ukraine would have continued. But what happened instead was, one, Ukraine became more solidly anti-Russian because of the intervention. It started getting more assistance from the West. At the same time, the most pro-Russian parts of the population in Crimea and in far eastern Ukraine were now no longer under Ukrainian control, and therefore not voting in Ukrainian elections. So it became pretty much impossible for a pro-Russian politician to win an election in Ukraine at the national level. So as a result, Russia had to find new ways, and it really shifted its focus to keeping Ukraine unstable to prevent its inclusion in NATO. Um, and so there were serious consequences for this. One, for Russia. So one was this break with the West, and it was really 2014 was the end of 25 years, more or less, of efforts by the West to integrate Russia, and not just by the West, but efforts by the West and Moscow together to a greater or lesser extent to integrate Russia into Western economic and to a lesser extent political structures. So so that was a big cost. There were domestic economic costs. Now they've handled them reasonably well, but there has been the sanctions that have been implemented on Russia have been a drag on Russian economic growth. And there was also the costs, although temporary as it turned out, but that pariah status that Russia had for some years afterwards it was kind of a personal image cost for Putin. So other consequence that we saw was an accelerating domestic crackdown in Russia. So this was really the moment when repression really took off in Russia, and it's been tightening ever since to prevent any chance of protests within Russia. And so at the same time, Russia really sort of doubled down on its efforts to create an anti-Western alliance, closer relationship with China at that point, more efforts to create other former Soviet states, kind of looking for other allies elsewhere in the world, including far off ones like Venezuela, and so forth. So there were serious consequences, but Russia found them acceptable. So that's kind of the precondition on the Ukraine side. I want to talk a little bit about the NATO-Russia relationship preconditions, much more briefly. So NATO enlargement, which you can see on this map, Russia was opposed from the start. The Yeltsin team saw it as breaking promises and has argued that the end of the Cold War and the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact has made the organization obsolete. So this was the main main issue in the downturn in relations with the West in the late 1990s. And there was some further deterioration after Kosovo when Russian leaders felt betrayed and humiliated by the lack of consultation by Western officials during the process leading up to the decision to bomb Serbia, because they saw that Russia had become so weak in the international scene that its opinion no longer mattered in determining international reactions to regional crises. So, I would argue that this whole the Russia-NATO relationship and the tensions caused by that have been one of the main causes of Russia's disillusionment with the West. And so the way that NATO they saw it as NATO behaving led Russian politicians and to some extent the public to believe that Western leaders still thought of Russia as a potential military threat. And despite the various, there were various perturbations back and forth. Putin famously, was restored cooperation with NATO as part of the global war on terrorism. And so there was cooperation from, through 2014. But overall, this tension between Russia and NATO has remained and really kind of became more and more acute in the aftermath of Putin's 2007 Munich speech. I have a few key quotes here you can look at. I'm not going to go through them. So he kind of laid out, this is a speech where he laid out his grievances with the West and the US-led world order. And then the next step was the Bucharest Declaration in 2008, which promised Georgia and Ukraine NATO membership. From the Western perspective, it was kind of in the indefinite future, the way to kick the can down the road. But in Moscow, it was seen as a promise of membership at some point, but a promise of membership. And so that meant that Russia saw an eventually closing window of opportunity to prevent NATO membership for these two countries before they got security guarantees. And so the first consequence was the 2008 Georgia war. and then the 2014 conflict, Ukraine conflict, which we talked about. So post 2014, there's been continued confrontation and deterioration of relations between Russia and NATO. And I probably don't need to go through that in detail. You're following the news and you're familiar with that. But what I think is important is that over time, US and NATO military cooperation with Ukraine has been gradually increasing. First, Ukraine just got non-lethal military assistance, then javelins, other weapons, trainers. There's been more Ukrainian participation in NATO exercises. And even the ostensibly less pro-Western current President Zelensky took increasingly anti-Russian positions because of the ongoing Donetsk conflict. So the political dynamics within Ukraine kind of led him there. Russian leaders have gradually come to believe that Ukraine is becoming a de facto NATO outpost, even without membership. And so Russia wants to end this. No NATO trainers, no NATO military assistance, no joint exercises, etc. And so Ukraine is in this unfortunate position of being seen by Moscow as part of NATO without the benefit of NATO's security guarantees. And that kind of brings us to where we are today. And this is just a map of where the territories that are currently under separatist control. You can see it's a fairly small part of Ukraine, just in the eastern border. Let me. This is the current troop locations. And what I want to say is that Russia has two primary goals in this confrontation. One is to have a firm say over Ukraine's foreign policy and internal governance, and two, they want to block further NATO expansion and end Ukrainian defense cooperation with NATO members. So, based on past experience with the Minsk Accords, the Russian leadership believes that Ukrainian promises can't be trusted. Therefore, they are likely to want to install a government in Kiev that is less hostile to Russia, ideally pro-Russian, but at least neutral. Now, this may be very difficult to achieve without occupation, which brings high risks, of course, in terms of potential resistance and the financial and political costs of controlling a hostile population in a large territory. So partition is another possibility with a pro-Russian government in the eastern and southern Ukraine. And I'll get into some of those options at the very end. Let me just talk a little bit about the forces. So what we see right now is something like 90 to 100 battalion tactical groups in terms of combat forces, along with support elements. So battalion tactical groups are task organized combat armed formations. They each average around 800 personnel, give or take, in size. So that translates into at least 75,000 combat troops. And then you have to add the supporting units. So the total number of Russian troops is probably over to 120,000. And then in addition to those regular Russian troops, there's also about 15,000 separatist forces, Russian-led formations in that Donbass region, which you see outlined in the big circle on the right. So this means that more than half of Russia's total available combat formations are currently stationed near the Ukrainian border. Plus, and this doesn't even take into account the additional aerospace forces and naval units in the area, which I'll get to in a second also. So, and there are two kinds of forces here, and I won't go into this in too much detail, but there's some forces that are stationed in the area permanently, and that's about half the combat forces and most of the supporting forces. And then there's second set of forces that have been temporarily deployed near Ukraine from elsewhere in Russia. And this includes from the North Caucasus, from areas outside of Moscow, from St. Petersburg, and even as far away as the Far East. And so that addition of those forces more than doubles Russia's offensive potential near Ukraine. And so, and of course, there's now, you can see on the map again, there's about 15 to 20 battalion tactical groups from the Russian Far East in Belarus conducting exercises right now. So that's about half of the Far Eastern district's combat potential. So they've really brought most of their forces to to the Ukraine region. And there's also let's see, here's another way of looking at this. This is just where the armies are, but I'll skip ahead because I want to mention the naval forces. There's a significant naval presence in the Black Sea right now that could potentially be used in an invasion. A good portion of the Black Sea fleet is out on exercises right now, which shows that they're ready for action. There's 6 additional amphibious landing ships that have come into the Black Sea from the Northern and Baltic fleets, and they could be used together with the Black Sea forces in a potential amphibious operation, either near Mariupol in the Azov Sea, on the eastern side, or near Odessa on the western side. So, so that leads us to the question of what can the Russian military do with these forces. I borrowed some maps here from CSIS that show some options. Because the way that Russia has positioned these forces gives it a variety of options, and that's important. It could undertake a limited operation in eastern Ukraine. That's not out of the question. It could also rapidly deploy to try to occupy the eastern half of the country, as is shown on this map, up to the Dnieper River. It could also move from the north and encircle Kiev. You see that on this map as well. Meanwhile, forces in Crimea, together with the Black Sea, naval forces could launch an operation to occupy the south, potentially cutting Ukraine off from the sea. And you see that on the left-hand map here. I think these two as a whole are less likely options. I think Russia probably doesn't have the forces to seize all of Ukraine. And I think this kind of land bridge to Transnistria doesn't achieve its goals of changing the government in Kiev. So I think these two options as a whole are a bit less likely. So then the question is, how can the Ukrainian military respond? The Ukrainian military is much stronger now than it was in 2015, but so is the Russian military. So the gap persists. And Ukraine's biggest problem is that its air defenses and air forces are relatively weak. And so Russia could quickly achieve air superiority, and that would make it very difficult for Ukrainian forces to resist a large-scale invasion with with conventional arms. So what it might be better off is doing an organized retreat and setting up resistance units to cause pain to a potential Russian occupation. But I think that it's possible that what Russia wants is not a long-term occupation, but they want to use that military victory to achieve the political aims that I spelled out earlier, and then withdraw. So create a pro-Russian government and then withdraw, but back it up with the potential threat of force should anything go wrong. Whether this is achievable or not is another thing. I think that's kind of where they would ideally like to go. In terms of timing, the forces are all in theater, are ready to go. I think the invasion could start at any time, depending on the political decision, which for all we know has already been made, and this is just kind of setting things up. There are alternative scenarios. So it's funny, in the last couple weeks, I've been hearing like these very parallel conversations where everyone who looks at the military development says an invasion is coming, and if you talk to kind of analysts that focus on particularly Russian domestic politics, and also Russian analysts within Russia, and even in Ukraine also, they think the war will not happen, and this is all kind of a big posturing move or big bluff and that sort of thing, and that Putin is trying to get concessions through a buildup. I don't think that version is likely. All along for the last several months, the way that Russia has engaged in diplomacy suggests that this diplomacy isn't serious, right? They keep kind of doing it in a very insulting way, very kind of pro forma ways. It's all confrontational. It's all in public. It seems to be more for show rather than to get a deal. Now, a couple of days when I was writing this 2 days ago, and it seemed like there were statements from both sides suggesting greater openness to compromise. As we see, that didn't last very long. We're now back, 2 days have passed and we're back to confrontation. Now, the one thing that I thought was interesting in all that was Zelensky's statement suggesting that Ukraine might give up the NATO treaty. If that actually gets formalized in some way, if Ukraine comes out, the US can't do this and NATO can't be upfront on this. But if Ukraine says, okay, we're going to be we're going to Finlandize ourselves, right? That's a potential way out. I think as time passes, it becomes less likely. Like it's hard to turn the train of invasion around at this point for Russia, I think. But nonetheless, it is a possibility. But again, this is something that NATO and the US would have to guarantee because Putin doesn't trust Ukraine to keep its word. So what the US has been trying and what the Western NATO has been trying to convince Putin to the cost of the war will be too high and that the potential concessions in an agreement might be sufficient and they could avoid a war. So again, this is all in terms of economic pain, since the West has pretty much telegraphed that it's not going to defend Ukraine militarily. And so what we're seeing is all sorts of actions on the part of the West that are signaling to Putin that there are huge concessions are not going to be made. He has to decide if the risk of war is worth it or not. And so that's a Putin decision. Are the costs of war worth it, or should he pocket some partial concessions, declare a victory, and go home? So far, all signals are indicating that that he's not taking that up, and that we're in for we're in for some problems. So I'll stop there. Thank you, and I'll look forward to hearing Barbara.
Thank you very much, Dmitry. That was great. Really appreciated that context. Barbara, as you're getting your slides up, I'm going to interject a question for Dmitry because this goes to more modern history. Of course, we all remember our own histories, most pronounced. And luckily, Barbara is going to take us on the history that many of us haven't learned who are not Russian historians. But our modern history, particularly really recent, is reflected in what happened in Afghanistan. So the question is, with 150 to 300,000 troops, if Russia were to get into Ukraine, occupying some portion of it, how long can they last, and would they encounter the kind of resistance that we eventually saw in Afghanistan, which was, insurgency and local unrest, and then, a disastrous exit, which they also had from Afghanistan. So are we looking at another Afghanistan for them?
So should I answer that now? Is that,
sure,
yeah.
Sure, go ahead.
So I think that, so I'll caveat, I'm not a Ukraine expert, right? I'm an expert on the Russian military. So what I hear from my colleagues who do work on Ukraine is that anti-Russian sentiment is very strong, and that a lot of people are prepared to resist. Whether, how effective that is, we'll have to see. I mean, Ukraine is not Afghanistan in terms of terrain, right? Like it's harder to hide out in the mountains when you don't really have mountains. But the potential for urban operations and what kind of IED type attack. I mean, all sorts of things are possible. Whether they will happen or not, and how effective they will be, and how much pain they will cause, I don't really know. Like that's the big question. There's some thought that that Putin is getting bad intelligence in terms of, or not necessarily bad intelligence, but that the Putin firmly believes that Eastern Ukrainians are still pro-Russian and is dismissing the various polling and so forth that indicates that they're not, and therefore is kind of making they will greet us with bread and flowers mistake that the US has made in the past in other places as well. So that by that account, the costs of occupation will be much higher than he expects them to be. But we don't know. It's one of those things that and we won't know immediately, even if there is an occupation, right? These things may take time to develop.
Right, of course. So speaking of time, um, I asked both of our speakers to answer the question, how did we get here? And Dmitry, you started with the sort of early 90s history, but I asked Barbara the same question. And Professor Barbara Walker from the University of Nevada, Reno is a historian. And so her idea of history goes back a little further. So with that, Barbara, please take it away.
So as I was saying, thank you so much for this opportunity, not only to speak, but also to listen. Fascinating presentation by Dmitry. I'm really especially interested in the troop formations and the potential developments as we see them. I'm a historian at the University of Nevada, Reno. My specialty is Russian history. I publish mostly on the topic of the Russian intelligentsia. And I actually have a book coming out in Russian in the next few days, a history of literary life at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, which I'm hoping will be purchased in Russia. I'm giving a background history because I was actually in Moscow when Ukraine seceded. And so I got to experience with a lot of Russian friends, the extreme ambivalence of their reaction. They were deeply dismayed, and it was not, these were many of my friends were dissidents. So it was not that they approved of Soviet imperialism, but rather that they felt that a deep bond had been broken and that there was nothing but trouble ahead, essentially. For that reason, I just wanted to go into this kind of deeper background history of the relationship between Russia and Ukraine, just to kind of give a sense of where those deep ambivalent feelings might have been coming from. I want to say that I have many friends in Ukraine as well, so I've been hearing from both sides of this. So I just kind of actually want to really go back to Slavic tribes and explain that essentially the origins of Ukraine, which is the original Russia, were in farmer Slavic tribes who wanted to farm winter rye, coming from Central Europe. They were moving to the east. On the one hand, and they came to encounter trader Vikings from Scandinavia. Their name, these Vikings, they came from a tribe called Rus. So that's actually where the Russian name comes from Scandinavians. These were very powerful, smart guys, these Vikings, and through their processes of raiding and trading on their way down to trade in the Byzantine Empire, Byzantium, what is now Istanbul. They tended to take over a number of these Slavic villages along the way, coming down the great rivers of this region. Kievan Rus stemmed from that relationship. It is to the south of present-day Russia. It lasted from about 880 to 1180 CE, and I cannot move to the next slide. Okay, let me just see if there's anything else I can do here. Okay, yes, now I can. Kievan Rus was a very powerful, sophisticated country connected with Byzantium, which was the center of of Christendom at that time. Highly literate, amazing art, very sophisticated politics. It was essentially ruled by Rus princes over Slavic populations. It converted to Eastern Christianity largely because of its trade relationship with Byzantium. For all of these reasons, many Russians to this day think of this powerful, beautiful country as their own heartland, even though in fact a different language is spoken in much of Ukraine today. So there's this kind of emotional connection of pride, dignity, and beauty that is very important to understand on the Russian side. Next comes the Mongol invasion. So basically I'm trying to explain a whole series of traumas that shaped these two different countries, Russia and Ukraine. The Mongol invasions come in, Genghis Khan in the 13th century. those were both more and less destructive than Christian monks of Russia tended to represent it as being. The most important political impact was that it broke Russia up into a series of feudal territories. It was called Appanage Russia. It is called Appanage Russia by historians of that time and place, as an appanage as being these feudal territories. What was deeply traumatizing was how well the Mongols, who were also very powerful, sophisticated rulers, really changed warfare in this region, played the Rus princes against each other very, very effectively. If anybody's ever watched the amazing Tarkovsky movie Andrei Rublev about an icon painter, you would see some scenes from this very, very effective means of turning the populations of this region against each other, these Rus princes. The reaction really begins in Muscovy against the Mongol control in the 14th century. So Muscovy was centered in Moscow. And you just happen to have a series of very talented political princes, Muscovite princes in this region, who began to gather in Russia. That is to say, to begin a process of ever expanding borderlands for the next 400 years, essentially. So this is a country with expansion as a means of self-protection that is deep in its DNA. Just to talk a little bit about how you got to this Russian autocracy. These princes, these smart Muscovite princes, were the origins. They experienced something that was called the Time of Troubles, which actually brought the Romanovs to power in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. The Time of Troubles was a time of extreme political unrest, chaos. Here's just a very, very chaotic image of the Time of Troubles here over on the right. Fear of political chaos, fear of political outside intervention, as Poles and Swedes, who are much bigger and tougher then than they are today. Fears of internal political division, and a desire for political control of their territory at all cost. And this too, I think, lies very deeply in the DNA of both countries in a certain sense. Another aspect, wait a minute, I feel as if I've lost a slide here, a really important slide. Here we go. Another really important aspect of this is that as Muscovy began to expand, farm workers, I guess you would call them, working on the Russian estates, began to flee. There was not very many of them. It was not a densely populated territory. And they began to flee central Russia, as it now is considered, around Moscow, to Ukraine, to the regions that were at that time the borderlands of Muscovite Russia. And actually the name Ukraina refers to the edge. And it used to be that you fled to the edge. Na Ukrainia is where you wanted to live if you wanted to get away from that farm work at the center of Russia. So depopulation was a problem, and this leads very directly to the rise of serfdom in the region, essentially as a means of capturing runaway farm workers. Serfdom was, and Ukraine was obviously considered an area to which these serfs, from which these serfs needed to be recaptured, essentially. So the law code of 1649 right here consolidated serfdom insofar as serfs, if they were ever caught, or rather farm workers, if they were ever caught, could be returned back to their central Russian estate for life. You also had the rise of the Cossacks in southern Ukraine, in a region of considerable importance to Russia and to this story, the region around the mouth of the Don River, Donetsk, Luhansk, the two Russian breakaway so-called territories. The Cossacks emerged in this region. They were deeply threatening to the Tsar and later would be co-opted very effectively. They were the offspring, essentially, and sort of a new kind of ethnicity that emerged from those runaway Slavic farmers and regional pastoralists or nomads of that territory. this leads to the emergence of a series of extremely violent uprisings coming out of that region around the mouth of the Don River, essentially led by the Don Cossacks. So Cossacks of this ethnic mixture, revolting against the power of Central Muscovy, or Central Russia at that point. These were called bunti. That's the plural, extremely violent, rape, pillage, destroy actions emerging from the south, led by Don Cossacks, and moving up. This went up to the time of Catherine the Great in the late 18th century, against Russian power, explicitly against the Russian aristocracy and the Russian autocracy. So another reason for tenderness in that region. Two of those rebel leaders are actually were celebrated by the Soviets, Stenka Razin in 1670, Emelian Pugachev in the late 18th century, as I described. Both men led extremely brutal uprisings. Both men were brutally executed by the Russians with things like disemboweling and so on. So I just wanted to review some of the traumas in this relationship: the Mongol invasion, which destroyed Kiev and Rus, the appanage divisions of Kiev and Rus that were so enhanced by the Mongols. The Ukrainian territories became a haven for runaway Muscovite farm workers, which led to serfdom. You had the Muscovite time of troubles, which led to extreme fear of chaos, political division, and external invasion. And that Donetsk, Luhansk region was also the source of Don Cossack rebels, such as Razin and Pugachev. And I wanted to bring us back in terms of traumas to what Dmitry essentially started with, that it was the Ukrainian secession that led to the Soviet collapse, essentially. And this was why my Russian friends, with the collapse of the Soviet Union when I was living in Moscow, were so ambivalent and worried about what was going to come next, clearly, rightfully, even though it's taken a while here. Thank you so much.
Barbara, that is fantastic. Thank you very much. I must admit, you did the impossible, which was to sum up all of that history in about 8 minutes. So thank you very much. That was quite impressive. Keith, if you don't mind, I'm going to hit a few questions because we've got a stack piling up, and then I'll come back to you after we do a couple questions. Great. So I'm going to start with a question that you kind of glossed over, Barbara, which was the impact of the Russian Revolution on the current situation. So you kind of passed over that part of it and went straight to the Soviet collapse. So what's the impact of the Russian Revolution?
No, I know that there is a strong narrative that Ukraine tried to become independent in the Russian Revolution, and mainly in the civil war thereafter, and that there were a couple of independent Ukrainian governments that were formed. I guess I personally just want to point out that the Russian Civil War was a period of extreme complexity. There's nothing better to reveal that than Mikhail Bulgakov's novel *The White Guard*, which reveals how in a single family you had a multitude of different political directions in Ukraine at that time, including anarchists, peasant Greens, Ukrainian nationalists, and more. So I'm a little dubious every time I hear that actually it had declared independence in the revolution, and that was kind of the end of the story until the Russians came in and destroyed that. It was very, very messy. That Russian Civil War was just had so many different sides that it's hard to discern clear political developments.
Excellent, thank you. So I'm going to ask a favor of you, Barbara. There are questions about, could you put in the chat both the name of the artist and the name of the movie and the name of your book and some of the things that you just referenced in your answer to this question. If you would be so kind to add them to the chat, I'll continue with some other questions. So Dmitry, coming back to you, there are lots of stories right now going on about what is happening for the troop movement. Why is it happening now? What happens with some really basic factors? The weather. Are the Russians really concerned about getting stuck in the mud? There are rumors, maybe true, maybe not, that there's COVID and Omicron outbreaks on both sides within the troops. From your glance right now, what should we be looking for as driving immediate action?
Sure. So first of all, I think I just want to since you mentioned it, I want to put to rest the mud question. The number of cases of Russian military carrying out, offensive actions in non-ideal terrain, let's put it that way, is not zero. So I don't think that is as big a constraint as people are making it out to be. Obviously, I mean, the whole point of having tracked vehicles is that they can go over, I mean, obviously you'd rather have firm ground than not firm ground, but it's not the end of the world. Plus, Ukraine, again, as I said, Ukraine is not Afghanistan. There are a lot of roads, so there are ways through most of Ukraine that do not require, getting stuck in the mud. So I don't think that's as much of an inhibiting factor as some people have made it out to be. As why specifically now? I think maybe there was a decision. Clearly, there was a decision that was made at some point in the fall to go ahead with a buildup. Now, whether at that point, I don't think Russian leadership thought for sure that they were going to go to war. I'm not sure. I'm not 100% sure that they're ready to go to war right now. I'm pretty close, but not 100%. But and then once that decision was made, it takes time to bring in all these forces, especially from farther away. Russian military is very dependent on rail networks for bringing large amounts of equipment across territory, and that takes time. So they can fly in the troops, which they've done now. Now, if we had this session, 3-4 weeks ago, I would have been saying, well, look, they've pre-positioned all this equipment, but the troops are still back home. The actual people to sit in the tanks and so forth. But now they're here, right? Or there. Now they're with their units, and there are also other signs that things are imminent, such as reports of field hospitals being set up, blood deliveries we've seen, and that sort of thing, right? So that's why the people who are focused on the military preparations are getting more and more anxious, because there's kind of a checklist of what you need to have in place before you go to war, as it were. And this checklist, people who write this, I'm not on Twitter that much, but there are people who wrote out exactly what we would need to see months ago, and now we've seen those things. And so that's the concern. And so that I'm not sure what that may be what you were looking for. I'm not sure.
That's perfect. Thank you. And I'm going to ask a question that's going to hit both of you. First, Dmitry, the issue of NATO. What's the impact of what's going on right now going to have on NATO in the future? Are we going to see? I heard an interview yesterday with the Finnish foreign minister who was saying, we were always pro-West, even when we said we were neutral. Now we're really pro-West. So is this, what happens to NATO? Are we going to see the let's fast forward and not look at what happens in Russia and Ukraine, but what happens to NATO as a result of these actions?
So NATO spent much of the last 30 years looking for purpose, right? And well, not the last 5, let's say the first 25 years or so of post Cold War period, right? And this would give it purpose again. I mean, I think it already has, honestly, post 2014. What we've seen is a realization that Russia is a threat to European security again, and that NATO and this is, the thing about NATO is that this is a thing that it knows how to do, right? It has, its whole history was about doing this thing, right? It was looking around for other things to do in Afghanistan or elsewhere, Kosovo, but this is the kind of the bread and butter for NATO. So I think we'll see more NATO unity. There are at least among the really important countries, right? There are outliers. I don't know what the Prime Minister of Hungary is going to do about this, right? I mean, he's but the overall NATO is, I think, going to be reinforced. The problem for NATO is that it has taken on a lot of new members that are not, in military terms, can't carry their weight, right? I mean, they're relatively small, relatively weak countries that join NATO because, well, for one of two reasons. Either they thought of NATO as a checkbox of this is a Western institution that we can show that we are part of the Western club, or, and in some cases, they were afraid of Russia and wanted protection, right? So this increases the costs, or the sort of what. It's one thing to defend the 16, right? Not all original, but the sort of the core Western members. Now you have a much broader territory with a much larger variety, and it's harder, to the extent that NATO really does function by consensus, as opposed to what Russia thinks, which is that Washington orders things up and everyone does what Washington wants. It's harder to achieve consensus when you have more members. So that's the difficulty. But again, Russia can. The threat of Russia can short circuit some of those difficulties because everyone can be united against one threat.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Dmitry. Barbara, I'm going to ask you the thorn in the side, thorn in the side question for Putin. How is this packaged sort of socio-culturally inside of Russia?
Well, to be honest, I mean, it's being packaged as a conflict, as essentially a breakaway province in a certain sense, that needs to be brought in. I think, yes, it's also being packaged very much as we must defend Russian borders. Again, it's drawing on a deep history, especially in the 20th century, of Western invasion of Russia itself. I have to add that personally, I'm completely unconvinced by this, but I think that it's playing pretty well in a popular Russian audience in a lot of ways. I mean, the impact of World War II, and I'll throw in another amazing novel that won the Nobel Prize in a minute to my list of things to take a look at. The traumas of World War II still are deep in Russia. I think Ukraine is very right to point out that it wasn't just Russia that suffered the German invasion. Ukraine suffered deeply as well in World War II. I would not discard those or leave those memories out of the sort of the deep well of really agony in that part of the world as a result of World War II.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Dmitry, back to you. We have the War Powers Act, and we did extend that in sort of indefinitely under the notional war on terror for years. Is a vote by the Duma necessary for the Russians to proceed with an invasion?
Honestly, I've not really kept track of like what those details under the Constitution and who is in charge of what. I think that what the most likely scenario is that there will be, and we're sort of seeing some signals of this today, is that there's some, sort of establishment or some attempts in the Russian media and by some Russian officials to establish the idea that war crimes are being committed in eastern Ukraine. So that then the justification, and this can be made in the Duma and probably will be made in the Duma, will be made in the UN Security Council, that Russia needs to undertake a humanitarian intervention to stop these war crimes, right? And then sort of kind of we're throwing Kosovo back at you, this kind of scenario is, I think, the likeliest pretext.
Yeah, got that. It does. Does anybody speak truth to power to Putin? Does he have anybody who isn't telling him what he wants to hear about what's going on in Ukraine? And is he getting any independent advice, or are they just going to tell him exactly what he wants to hear?
Well, we don't know for sure. Obviously, we don't. But the suspicion, all indications are that he used to get a wider range of opinions, and that over time, especially in recent years, that circle has been narrowing, and it particularly narrowed with COVID, because he's so paranoid about COVID that there are very few people can come and talk to him. So the people that used to the sort of the economist bloc, right? The kind of Alexei Kudrin, the ministers of economic situation, development and so forth, who used to come and tell him, look, here are the costs of your, hawkish security policies, now don't really have access to him. And so the only people he's really talking to are the people who are even more hawkish than he is, like Nikolai Patrushev, the head of the Security Council, for example. And so this creates a little bit of a closed loop. And this is why when I mentioned, that he was maybe discounting some of the polls that show that Eastern Ukrainians are less pro-Russian than they used to be, this may be part of that. The reason for that is that, he's not hearing alternative opinions the way he was before. And this is a known problem of personalist autocracy, right? This happens over and over again in all sorts of different places. The longer an autocrat stays in power, the more sycophantic his immediate circle is, and the narrower it is. And so I think we're seeing that, he's been in charge for 22 years now, and we're seeing that. And I think he was very good at avoiding that for many years, but time takes its toll.
Yes, and to paraphrase Condi Rice, Moscow is its own conversation now. So Barbara, I'm going to bounce this next question to you, which is because you're on the sort of the pulse of what's going on in the Russian people, and you said there's a bit of an ambivalence and maybe not really focused or don't think the war is really going to happen. But let's just say it does. What are they willing to take in terms of casualties? Are we going to see the response like the white tulip issues and Afghanistan and those kinds of things? Where do you think that's going to go?
I do not know. I think that's impossible to predict at this point. Yes, there was this movement against, the Soviet Afghan invasion, the white tulip phenomenon, which contributed to the end of the Soviet Union ultimately. I guess I think of the internal repression that Dmitry described as being extremely significant in what happens next. Especially the Russian millennial generation, led at this point by the imprisoned Navalny, has been silenced brutally over and over again. Every effort to kind of speak truth to power. It is a deeply tragic generation in that sense. At this point, my sense of people is that they just want to be able to get by. They just want to live. They want to have good families. They want to make money. They want to survive. And they've been profoundly intimidated by these domestic crackdowns. I do not think it's an accident that Nesu China, as the Russians say, I do not think it's an accident that Navalny right now is being brought to trial yet again.
Yeah, and then that's not making the news much, given the rest of the circumstances. So thank you for that. I'm going to ask both Dmitry and Barbara if you would be willing to put your email in the chat box. I know there are some questions that we're not going to get to, and people may have follow-up. If you're willing to do that, that would be great. We would appreciate that. So with that, Keith, I do apologize, but I'm going to give you the last word to kind of wrap this up and let us take us out on your perspective, of course, from many years from the inside the intelligence community, and what you think. How do we put it? How do we see where we are now, and what's going to happen in the next few days? That's a short question for the last 2 minutes.
Yes, that's all I have to comment on.
Yeah, that's all you have to comment on. So
yeah, thank you, Maureen. And I thank Dmitry and Barbara both for Dmitry being much more sensitive to what's going on in contemporary Ukraine than I certainly have been willing to put the effort into following. And Barbara, you stole a lot of my thunder historically, because back in the 60s and 70s, as a Russian history student, that still affects greatly my perspective on how the Russians look at the world and look at their immediate neighborhood. So thank you for your comments. Let me just make a couple of points, if I may. First of all, on Putin himself, my sense is he reflects the Russian soul, post-Cold War Russian soul. Maybe not the millennials who've been locked up, but the deep Russian soul. Let me live my life. We are tough. We'll get through it. But Russian nationalism, strong Russian nationalism, and paranoia, I think, govern the Russian outlook on the rest of the world. Ukraine has its own nationalism, of course, and its own paranoia, particularly vis-a-vis Russia. But let me go back a little bit. I was happy that finally you came in with the 20th century, with the Nazis going into both Russia and Ukraine, a very brutal time in the 20th century for those who already were paranoid about what comes from the West. And Ukraine was a very key buffer for the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Getting to the question of what happens if they go in, look what happened in Czechoslovakia. Look what happened. Anti-NATO demonstrations all over Europe. August 22nd, 1968. The Russians are not so benign after all. So NATO gets reconsolidated. And I think what we're being able to see already is Western Europe, the EU and NATO countries beginning to circle the wagons, saying, well, maybe we need to stand up to the bear one more time. Now, Ukraine clearly has always been stuck between Russia and its neighbors, particularly Byzantia, because as the Russian Empire was expanding, so was the Ottoman Empire expanding towards the north. And so Ukraine became a very, very helpful buffer. Now, at times, it was territory just to be held as a buffer. Sometimes it was territory to be controlled. But I want to come back to something Dmitry touched on, that is Russia having a warm water port in the Black Sea has been a strategic goal in all of Russian history. So that Crimean Peninsula was essential to Russia's security. And I was not surprised that Russia went in and said, we're going to take it over because it's ours and our security depends on it. That was not a surprise. I'd say we would have done the same thing if we'd been in the same situation. It's too important strategically for the Soviet military and now the Russian military not to have that warm water port. Now, keep in mind, Russification has always been one of Russia's tools in intimidating its neighbors. As the empire expanded and took over all of its various neighboring peoples, Russification became its a tool of control. But that led to resistance as well. We have historical Ukrainian resistance, and getting into that issue, I'm sure it's still there and will rise again, particularly if the Russian military goes in. I want to touch on one other point, and that is the collapse of the USSR. Since I was involved in nuclear arms negotiations at the time, guess what? Soviet strategic nuclear arsenal all of a sudden now was in 4 independent countries. The US was freaked out. NATO was freaked out. What's going to happen with these nuclear weapon systems? Yes, the warheads, but also the missiles, the bombers, et cetera, et cetera. And with Yeltsin in control in Moscow and George H.W. Bush in Washington, the sentiment was, well, Russia's going to be a lot more benign now. They're going to be more like us. There's a chance there'll be a democracy, et cetera, and we can work with them. What we need to do, our first priority, is reconsolidate all of Soviet strategic nuclear weapon systems in Russia. Get them out of Kazakhstan, get them out of Belarus, and get them out of Ukraine. Well, guess which of the 3 countries was last willing to give them up? Ukraine. Because all of a sudden the Ukrainians say, hey, we now have a nuclear arsenal. The big bear is to the east. Now we can defend ourselves against him. We've got Blackjack strategic bombers. We've got SS-24 missile systems. We're fat, dumb, and happy. Let's hang on to these guys. And I led a couple of NIE efforts in the early 90s, 92, 93, because the White House was said, are they going to give them up or are they not? And it was really on the edge. There was no guarantee they were going to give them up. Only when we, the US and NATO, put pressure on the Ukrainians to give them up, giving them security guarantees that we will protect them from the bear. Ukraine finally gave in and said, okay, we'll give them up. Now, what the likelihood that the US and NATO is going to protect Ukraine against the Russians? I'd say it's kind of dubious, because that could lead to a conflict, which who knows where the boundaries would be. Well, guess what? Russia didn't turn out to be as benign as we had hoped it would in the early 90s. And therefore, we see Putin intimidating Ukraine, diplomacy, to the extent there is any, through power. And I believe that that what he's doing, he's posturing to keep us off balance and to keep himself plenty of options as to what he decides he wants to do if he hasn't already decided already. So really, he's driving the train, and we're in a reactive mode. And I'm concerned that our reactions may be inadequate to give the Ukrainians the warm, fuzzy feelings that we're covering their backs. Thank you.
Wow. Keith, thank you. You interjected yet another piece of history that was absolutely critical. I remember those days well, in the strategic nuclear disarmament days, when we were wondering whether Ukraine would part with their weapons. And here we are now trying to decide whether we're rearming them. So what I hope, NSF, you gleaned from this is that the situation is far more complex than what you're seeing on CNN. So when you do look at the news, regardless of what your news sources are, when you do look at the news, keep in mind this history is complicated, and there are a lot of factors that are driving it. What happens in the next few days is really maybe the culmination of what's happened for the last several hundred years. So with that, I thank all of our speakers. Dmitry and Barbara, you gave us a phenomenal insight into a situation that we were only just glancing the skim of the very surface of in our news coverage recently, and you gave us something to think about as we look at what happens moving forward. So thank you very much for your participation. And please do stay in touch. If there's anything else that you think our audience should know, I would be happy to pass it on. And please, everybody, stay safe.